Throughout history, gardens have been essential to the lives of cottagers, and I think they still are. Few of us today need to grow vegetables and herbs to keep body and soul together, but some modern uses are just the same as they've always been. There's an old countryman's saying that says, "Sometimes I sits and thinks, and sometimes I just sits." And I think that that sums up a very important part of the cottage garden. Everyone should have somewhere where they can sit and just contemplate the garden and relax and let the stresses of life just drain away. So in my gentleman's cottage garden, I've invested in a relatively expensive love seat. But it's not as expensive as you might think, because I searched around and found a local craftsman who built this for about 2/3 of the cost of the ones advertised in the glossy magazines. I think that's quite an important thing to do, because not only do you save yourself money, but I think that we cottage gardeners ought to be keeping those rural crafts alive. And I made sure when he built it that he incorporated a trellis in the side so that I can grow some perfumed climbers. This little clematis is a small flowered clematis with a large, unmanageable name, I'm afraid. Tritonata rubro marginata, quite a mouthful. But it has a beautiful vanilla perfume which really fills this little arbour. And growing on the trellis at the sides there is a quite vigorous rambler, Bobby James, which will eventually cover the whole arbour with beautiful trusses of white perfumed flowers. It is a vigorous plant, but as we saw last week, it's quite easy to keep it under control. This week, I'll be showing how I made the structures in my own cottage gardens and looking at some of those in established gardens that inspired them. Of all the cottage gardeners I visited, Roger Pickering was the most ingenious. And that's a green man, isn't it?
It is it's my version of a green man anyway.
Well, you can find these in churches and old buildings all around the country. What exactly was it?
It's an old pagan thing. I don't quite know. I presume it's something to do with fertility. It's equivalent of, you know, the old earth goddess. I don't know.
And where did you get it?
Oh, I carved that.
My goodness, what's the stone?
Well, it's just old soft building block. Not the concrete ones, all the soft insulating.
Yeah.
It's quite soft, actually. It's easily workable.
You're a talented man, you know, Roger.
Well, a good bodger.
Real cottage gardeners don't buy a lot for their gardens. If you visit a genuine old cottage like this one, you'll find all sorts of examples of what the old cottagers would call make do and mend. Now, this garden shed, for example, used to be an air raid shelter in World War II. But when the bombs stopped falling, it was much too valuable to throw away. So it was dismantled, transported here and re-erected, and it's been here ever since. This garden bench used to be an old sofa that fell to pieces. And with the addition of a few bits of scrap timber and an old carpet to add a touch of luxury, it makes a serviceable place for the gardener who lives here to take a break in between spells of digging. And there's no doubt at all that in this particular setting, it's a thing of beauty. But the seat in one cottage garden I visited appeared a bit more sophisticated.
Well, it's homemade.
It's homemade?
Yes.
Well, it's stone, surely.
Well, it's made of concrete.
But it's got these lovely curved edges on it.
Yes, well, my husband made it, and we decided we wanted a seat just big enough for two of us to sit on, so we sat on the floor in the living room on a piece of brown paper and drew round our two bottoms, making a pattern from which he...
It's really tailor-made,
turned out a concrete seat, yes.
And how did you get these edges?
Well, this is a piece of pipe cut in half and laid around the edge of the moulding.
What, ordinary hose pipe?
Yes.
Is it reinforced?
Yes, it is. Has a piece of wire mesh incorporated in the concrete.
It's brilliant. He's a clever chap, isn't he? And hasn't it weathered down well?
Yes, it has.
Really nice. Well, I'm certainly not going to try and compete with that masterpiece, but it isn't difficult to knock up your own garden furniture very cheaply. This bench, for example, is made with a few bits of 50mm square timber and some very strong timbers for the seat and the back, and it's all just screwed together to make a very serviceable bench. But if you're going to eat out in the garden, or just have a cup of tea really, then you need a table. And this is a little bit more elaborate. Now the legs are very strong. They're made with fencing posts and they support a 15cm, that's 6-inch deep box. The box is filled with a very gritty compost and planted up with thymes. And I've set into it these thin tiles to give me somewhere to rest my cup or my plate. It's a table that will never need a cloth because it provides its own tapestry of beautiful colour and perfume too. Cheers. If your house is small, and particularly if it's terraced, you very often won't have a garage, and certainly in a small garden, no room for a garden shed. So it's difficult to know what to do with the tools. Well, this chest should solve the problem. It's very cheap and easy to make using floorboards for the front and the sides, and the top is made with ordinary feather edge fencing boards. But once again, do make sure that you get it pressure treated with preservative. It's quite big enough to hold all the tools that you're going to want for a garden of this size. If you're more tidy-minded than I am, then you could fit it out with hooks to hold the tools and shelves and even drawers. And it tucks away in the corner there where it takes up very little space. The traditional cottage garden arch is more or less essential, and I was intrigued by some metal ones I discovered at Cottage Garden Roses.
We actually went to the Black Country Museum to find out how they were made, and they were steel bent on edge. And the important point about that is that they're actually quite strong and that they give in the wind, whereas a rigid structure would be inclined to blow right out.
Well, once again, of course, you've covered it with roses. What is this one?
This is Tuscany Superb. It's a rose from the Middle Ages, and it's a shrub rose. But actually, shrub roses make very good climbing roses if you just take them up slowly, a little bit at a time, and tie them in as they go.
And down here is an arch with two roses on, this lovely soft violet, and this one is something like Rosamundi, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's actually an Italian rose from the turn of this century. It's called Variegata di Bologna. Marvellous perfume. And the joy, again, with shrub roses is that they do actually frame an arch very attractively.
Now, this arch is quite wide.
Yes, it is. It's 6 foot wide. The idea being that two people can walk through side by side, whereas if you have a 4-foot arch, you have to go through Indian style.
Well, you're lucky, John, really, to have that sort of space. Most of us don't have. But you've got some narrower arches here, done, I think, in a very artistic way to make a sort of a garden divider.
Yes, that's the idea, that you don't actually cut the whole garden off, that you get glimpses of the garden through it. And I think, that makes you want to go into the garden because you can actually see what's beyond you.
Another very beautiful arch can be made out of willow withies woven together. But not all the cottage gardeners I talked to insisted on traditional materials. Now here, just outside the house, you've got a lovely arch with a rose on one side and a clematis on the other, and it's wooden. Or is it?
No, it isn't wood, you're quite right. It's made of waste polystyrene, and it's completely solid. It doesn't need any protection at all of any kind. You can hammer nails into it. They make furniture, garden furniture, edging.
Is that the edging down there?
Yes, that is it, there. And it's a dual purpose, as you see, holding the soil back and looking very nice at the same time.
Whatever it's made of, an arch makes a beautiful feature, and nowhere more so than over the front gate. And it's very easy to make. If you can handle a saw and a screwdriver, then you're home and dry. though there are a couple of things in the toolkit that you might not have that I think are worth buying because I found them invaluable. But do bear in mind that if the budget doesn't run to it, you can hire all these things very cheaply from the local hire shop. Most people will have the basic toolkit, but what you might not have is a long spirit level, which is invaluable when you're setting things like fence posts. And there are quite a lot of angles in the archway in particular, so a bevel square is a very useful tool. And another thing which I found I couldn't do without was a rechargeable electric drill. Now, if you haven't got electricity in the garden, this is the perfect tool. I've already put the upright posts in, and these are put in exactly like ordinary fence posts. The only thing to notice is that I've put them into metal sockets, which are actually concreted into the ground. Now, all the timber, you'll remember, is pressure treated with preservative, but putting them in those sockets just makes doubly sure that they'll last for life. I've made sure that all the woodwork is very simple. The only technique you might have to master is cutting the angle. Start by measuring carefully and then mark the edge of the wood with the set square. The angle on the face of the wood is marked with the preset bevel square, and then you can saw it, starting off very gently and carefully and keeping to both lines. In fact, the building techniques involved in all the stuff I've made for the artisan's garden are pretty easy. There are no complicated woodworking joints to master because you mostly join one bit of wood to another with simple metal angle brackets. The heftier bits are drilled first and then held with coach screws, which are driven home with a spanner. Some small pieces are screwed on, and bits like the roofing lath trellis are held with nails. The final job is to put on these finials, and they have two very important purposes. First of all, you'll see that at the front of the arch my woodwork leaves quite a lot to be desired, and the finial will cover a multitude of sins. But much more important is its traditional use. It stopped the devil sitting on top of the arch. Once the honeysuckle starts to grow and cover the arch, you can begin to see how welcoming this is going to be. And the little rose arbor over here is made in more or less the same way. It's a little wider, and of course you can make it any width that you want. And there are one or two differences. The back is also filled in with trellis, and I've also provided a seat here made out of thick timber because quite obviously you don't want to fall through it, do you? This one has got a roof on it as well, and the roof is made with ordinary feather edge fencing timber. My final touch was to nail on this horseshoe, obviously put on upright so that it catches all the luck that's in the garden. Now, I actually dug that out of the garden here when I was preparing it, and I feel that it's important to keep and use all these relics just in order to preserve the continuity. Even in this beautiful cottage garden attached to a modern house, Roger Pickering has managed to make links with gardens of the past.
Well, they're all sherds of pottery or tile that have been dug up in this garden.
When do they
Time.
date from?
The earliest pieces are Roman.
Gosh, which one is Roman?
Well, you've got a Roman tesserae there from the old floors. Yeah. And then we've got a medieval floor tile. A bit of early medieval, where possibly from Nuneaton or Potter's Marston, and right up to 19th or 18th century clay pipe. It's reasonably early, as I understand it. I mean, I'm no expert. It's a fairly shallow angle, that.
Now, Roger, you live in a modern house with a modern cottage garden, but I think that you have the soul of an old cottage gardener because you collect all sorts of junk and turn it into something beautiful. Tell me about these seats.
Well, these baths as they are. I don't know where we acquired them originally, but they were in the sheds, I think, in the old garden. And when we came across to here, which is, what, 4.5 years ago, we just used them as holding ponds for the fish.
Because they're old bungalow baths, aren't they?
Yeah. And after we'd finished using them, once we dug a pond and so forth, I'd got them stacked up here somewhere, and I was about to throw them down, the local tip. And it seemed such a shame, and it suddenly struck me. I don't know why or when or how, but they'd make a seed.
And you're not going to like this, Roger. Sometimes you do make mistakes, don't you? What about your windows?
Oh, well, it was a wooden shed behind there, and it looked pretty gaunt, actually, so I started to build a stone front on it. Now, we had this old bookcase. It was in pieces in the roof of the old house, and we brought it across and stored it here. And it suddenly struck me that the two doors on the bookcase would make windows, and that's what I did. And it wasn't until the place was complete that when I was cleaning the glass from the inside, I discovered there was a name scratched inside, as they did with a diamond ring, years ago.
Yeah.
And it says, John Hollins Jr., 20th of December, 1767. So, I've broken up a very good piece of furniture, actually, to make a couple of windows.
The perfume in my arbour comes from roses, but one of the plants they would have used in the old gardens quite widely would have been the native honeysuckle, or what they called woodbine. Of course, that's been superseded these days by many other varieties, but I still think that the old woodbine has the very best fragrance of all. So I wanted to grow it in my own garden. Well, there are nurseries who stock it, but I searched around and couldn't find it at all. And then one day, no doubt because of the horseshoe nailed to my arbour, I had an amazing piece of luck. I was standing at the garden gate and looking out at the hedgerow nearby when suddenly I saw, growing over an old wire fence, the native woodbine. I don't know how it got there, perhaps a seed was dropped by a bird, but that now enabled me to do exactly what the old cottagers would have done to bring it into my own garden. Now, of course, these days you can't dig up wild plants, that's against the law. But what you can do is, in June or July, to take leaf bud cuttings, and they're a lot easier than they sound. The first thing to do is to take off a stem, and you get several cuttings from one stem, put it into a polythene bag, keep it in the shade and get home as fast as you can. Now, if you haven't got a workbench in the garden, what you can do is to adapt the tool chest as I've done. All it needs is a little flap of wood hinged to the front and held with a little toggle. And when you pull it down, it sets the top of the toolbox level. You can put your potting bench on top of that, and it's easy to work. And then you cut the stem up, cutting either side of a leaf to leave pieces of stem, I suppose something like 1 inch long. Now, don't put hormone rooting powder on them because that could stop them growing out. Just as they are, put them into a pot of coir compost so that the top of the bud is just above compost level. Cover them up with a polythene bag, put an elastic band round it and put them in the cold frame. They should root in about 6 to 8 weeks. And of course, if you want one plant, take 10 cuttings. I think it's vital to grow scented plants near to anywhere you might sit in the garden. For example, in the area I laughingly call my patio, I'm absolutely surrounded by perfume. Probably the best of all comes from roses, and I've got a climber here, Blush Noisette, which is quite an old variety introduced in the 19th century, and that will eventually grow to completely cover this fence. And it's got this lovely clusters of flowers with an absolutely superb perfume. And just over here is a new English rose, the Dark Lady, with a superb perfume that wafts right over to where I'm sitting. On the fence here is Brother Cadfael. Now that's another English rose, and that's finished its first flowering, but you can see where the buds are forming for the second. And you can also see where I pruned it back when it had finished flowering the last time. It's well worth doing this to try and encourage another flush of flowers later on. And then there's this lovely cottage garden plant, a real old one this, Sweet Rocket or Dame's Violet. That has its best flowering a bit earlier in the season, but it's hung on right till nearly the end of July. And of course that comes in white or in purple, and it has a lovely perfume. Over this side of the garden is my little herb garden, and you have to really pick a little bit of this and smell it to get the full value of the perfume, but of course that's the perfect way to keep the plants in trim too. And don't forget that on my little table here it's planted up with thymes, and just rub your hand over those and oh, that's delicious. Now your gateposts are a real work of art. Where did you actually get the idea for that?
Well, I don't know about ideas yet. I don't know where ideas originate. It's a difficult thing to say, but I think the tiles were off the old house roof, and I think tiled pillars like that I first saw at Great Dixter.
And what gave you the idea of twisting them like this?
I love some of these old chimneys, you know, country house chimneys, twisted, all sorts of shapes, beautiful brickwork.
Must have been quite a job to do, I should think.
Well, the trouble is that they're all Staffordshire stoneware tiles, and they don't absorb moisture, so
Right.
they tend to float anyway. Also, of course, we've got a problem with keeping vertical.
Yes, sure.
You know, you've got to do a full turn before you can check it.
And where did you find this beautiful gate?
Well, this and its companion actually were lying in the orchard, leaning against the end wall when we came here nearly 40 years ago. They had been used as gates in the old rectory orchard.
And instead of using it as a gate, you've used it as a support for cord and apples. That's brilliant.
Well, it's not too bad. It seems to work. I don't know where we got the idea of cord and apples. It may be us.
In small gardens, even the most utilitarian objects must be made to look beautiful, whether they're growing in amongst the plants or the plants are growing in them. Pinks and carnations have been grown in pots since Elizabethan times. They used to call them gillyflowers then, which I think is a lovely name. But of course they had exactly the same problems with growing them on heavy soil that we have. So for them, the solution was to grow them in pots of very gritty compost. The only difficulty is that with a lot of pinks and certainly all carnations, they do tend to grow a little bit tall, and so therefore they tend to flop over a bit. So you need a support for them, and the Elizabethans made a very attractive one out of wicker work. Well, if you've got a willow tree growing in your garden that you prune every year, then it should be no problem getting ideal material. But if not, you should be able to buy some from a basket maker, or try the art shop who sell basket making materials. Now, a trained basket maker could make a much better job of it than I can, but I cheat a little bit by using florist's wire, which you can buy just for a few coppers from the florist, and just hold it together like that at the top. And then you need some thinner stuff around the bottom to hold it. That will go around, and that again can be fixed with the florist wire, and it makes quite a firm job, and it will last for several years in actual fact. And you finish up with something like this, which I think looks rather attractive, and it certainly does the job. Now you'll notice that in this garden I've used entirely terracotta pots. Now these are quite expensive, so in the artisan's cottage garden I've looked for other things. Mind you, if you search around the second-hand shops, you can even pick up old terracotta pots very cheaply. I think galvanised iron is a great material for cottage gardens. This bucket is a bit shiny and new at the moment, but once it's weathered down, it'll look very attractive. And you could use a mop bucket for an oval shape, And for a bit more variety, how about florist buckets, which come in a variety of sizes? Or, of course, you can make your own out of wood. This is my version of a Versailles tub, for example, which is very simply made with a wooden framework and a little bit of matching nailed onto it. And you can buy these little acorns in the do-it-yourself shop. And quite honestly, if you can use a saw and a screwdriver, it's very easy to make. You can use all kinds of interesting things for containers. This one, for example, is a sagger, and it's used by potters to protect pots when they go into the kiln. And the potters of old used to use them extensively in their gardens. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and you can still buy them second-hand if you're very lucky, or you can get them new. But the classiest container I've got in my garden is this copper urn. It is, in fact, no more than an old hot water cylinder cut in half, and I bought it from my local plumber for the price of a couple of pints. Next to my hot water cylinder, I hung my version of an auricular theatre. They're really just shelves designed to carry a display of colourful pot plants. Now, these theatres have a fascinating history dating back to the days when home workers like weavers would grow plants for competition. Auriculas, tulips, pinks and several others were called florist's flowers, and they needed a lot of attention. So they were ideal for weavers to grow because they worked at home. Well, home working is coming back, so maybe history will repeat itself. The word florist then had a very different meaning. It meant someone dedicated to creating a perfect flower, and perfection was defined by a strict set of rules for each flower. The auricula, for example, had to consist of perfect concentric circles, each in exact proportion to the one surrounding it. The great Victorian gardener Gertrude Jekyll loved cottage gardens, but she had no time for what she described as the petty tyrannies of the florist, teased and tortured to carry off a prize. Well, I think that's a little bit hard, and there's no doubt that florist flowers have given a lot of people a great deal of pleasure over centuries. But still, it's the plants in the borders that really make a cottage garden. Next week, we'll be finding out what the old cottage gardeners grew and how they grew them, and we'll also be looking at some improved versions that are available for our new cottage gardens that they would have given their eye teeth for.